Good afternoon. If you have a relationship that is growing, you of necessity are going to have some sort of conflict. It's sort of like if you have motion, you'll have friction. And the more motion, the more friction, right? It's the scientific principle. And if you have a healthy relationship, you're going to have some disagreements you're going to have to work through. And the more, activity you have, the more things you're going to have to work through, and understanding how to work through conflict is extremely important. One writer said marriage is two becoming one, and the whole time you're trying to figure out which one you're becoming. One fellow said this. He said, one nice thing about being single is all the decisions are unanimous. And a lot of truth in that. When you're single, you just sort of, you don't have to consult all these other parties. One of the things I find fascinating is I grew up in a home with 3 other siblings. They had 4 kids, and we'd have these family my dad called them collaboration sessions, and we'd call us in, and he'd say, okay, where are we going to go on vacation this year? And we would go up to the Santa Cruz area to see my uncle, my dad's brother, and our cousins every year, and then we'd have a week where we'd just do something different for variety. And we had the hardest time, my 3 sisters and I, agreeing on where we would want to go on vacation. I mean, it was so amazing. You get this beautiful opportunity to go and have some fun. And my mother's idea of roughing it was a black and white and a Holiday Inn. And so I would want to do something kind of more like what a guy would want to do, and my sisters would poo-poo it. And it was just really interesting. The more people you have involved, the more complicated things become. It's really true. So Sam and Natalie, you're going to go from 1 to 3, right, in this family. And a lot of fun, but things can become a little bit more complicated when you increase the number of people that need to be consulted and dealt with in regards to major decisions. The number one criteria necessary for long-term marital stability and happiness is the ability to resolve conflict successfully. It's the positives that initially draw us together. We're attracted to someone, we want to get to know them. But it's the negatives when they come out and how we deal with them or don't deal with them that ultimately pulls people apart and causes people to get divorced. In fact, there's 4 precursors of divorce. One is chronic criticism and contempt, which is what we talked about on Friday night. By the way, how you all doing on your criticism fast? How's that coming along for you? And then you've got defensiveness and withdrawal. What do all those things have in common? They all deal with conflict resolution. See how important this is to having a long-term successful relationship. One writer said, the key to succeeding in marriage is not so much finding the right one as it is to learning to fight well with the one you've already found, which is just another way of saying you need to be willing to work through difficulties and conflict. Let's look at some general pointers. First of all, be really careful what you say, because one zinger, one really hurtful name-calling session, one profanity, it can just erase up to 20 positives. So that's why we just sang the song, angry words onet them never from the tongue unbridled slip. Proverbs 12 and verse 18 says, reckless words are like the sword of the tongue, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but a grievous word stirs up anger. Proverbs 10:19, when words are many, transgression abounds. Secondly, when in doubt, wait. If you've got something you want to say and you know it's going to be a pretty heavy criticism or comment, first of all, don't do it unless you get permission first, right? We talked about that on Friday night. And even then, be really cautious. You can always go back and say it later, but it's not so easy to take it back once something is said. And remember that relationships and communication in relationships have momentum. Proverbs 17:14, starting a quarrel is like breaking a dam, so drop the matter before a dispute breaks out. And so that's kind of the way it works. I mean, you say one thing nice and your spouse responds with something else that's nice, and then you say something even nicer and you go back and forth, and you can kind of build in a very positive way. On the other hand, if you say something that's hurtful and then the other party responds defensively with some sort of barb, and then you respond back in turn, and before you know it, you're kind of going this way. And what you need to do is, if you sense that things are going real negative, one of you, hopefully the husband who's going to take the leadership in this, says, you know what, I really care about our marriage and our relationship. This is not going in the right direction. Why don't we back off? I apologize for what I just said. I hope you'll think about apologizing for what you just said, and we'll pick this up later. Just stop it in its tracks, because so oftentimes things can get out of hand. And beware of the egalitarian marriage. That's the modern day way of viewing marriage, and that's where everything is 50-50, and there isn't any recognition of any God-given roles. Remember, in the Bible, you have God, Christ, man, woman, and you got angels thrown in there somewhere. But the point is, there's an order to relationships. And in a modern egalitarian marriage, you don't really have anyone that is appointed as the tiebreaker. And that's really the way I try to encourage couples to think about it. If you're having a difficulty, you listen to each other, you try to come to a win-win proposition if at all possible. But if you just can't really come to an agreement, at some point you've got to say, well, we need to have the tiebreaker break the tie. I mean, when you deal with things in government or in business, you always have somebody that is set aside to make the final decision. In the Supreme Court, you only have 9 members. Why an odd number? So you don't ever have a tie. We have a log jam. You'll have a lot of 5-4 decisions, but a decision of 5-4 is how you avoid dealing with a tie. In the Senate, you got 50 states, 2 senators from every state. That's 100 members. But what did the Constitution set up as, what do you do if it's 50-50? The vice president breaks the tie. And when I used to work on the administrative team at Florida College, sometimes we administrators would have different priorities and different things, particularly about the budget, and we would plead our case, and then we'd expect President Caldwell to make the decision. And that was fine. It wasn't that he was a better person than us. It wasn't he was, more worth in God's sight than us. It was he's the president and we weren't. There's roles that we have to understand that we play, and it has nothing to do with worth or one party being, somehow rather demeaned by the fact that somebody is set up to be the tiebreaker. And so beware of that. If there's no final arbitrator of disputes, it winds up with just constant conflict. All right, so let me give you a quick example about how this worked in our marriage many years ago. I'd worked at Florida College until about 2004. I didn't want to continue raising money. That was really a difficult job, and I was just tired of it. And so I decided, let's just go into local work. And I thought I'd find a job local there in Tampa somewhere, and we'd stay put. And my wife said, no, let's move up to Kentucky. That's where our 2 daughters are. Amy and Allison were in school up in WKU and up at UK. And at any rate, my folks had just moved to Tampa to be with us, and we would be leaving them. And I don't know, it's like, why? We can't be chasing our kids all around the country. They're not going to be there very long. Then what do we do? And anyway, so I wanted to stay, and she wanted to move. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And we could not agree on that. And it was getting kind of tense. You're going to have that in marriages, right? It's not a moral issue. It's just a matter of what are we going to do here? And so finally Gail said, you know what, I know you love me and I know you want to do the right thing. You know how I feel and why I feel the way I do. So I'm just going to pray that you will have the wisdom to make the right decision, and whatever you decide, I will back you 100%, cheerfully and willingly, because that's what I'm supposed to do. We're a team. That's a great example, I think, of submission, kind of putting the husband in his place, avoiding unnecessary conflict. And so here she's saying, I'm praying that you'll have the wisdom to make the right decision, and she's leaving it up to me. So we moved to Kentucky. And I didn't want to disappoint her. I wanted to please her. And that was so sweet, versus us having this, tug of war that was just kind of endless. And you know what? We moved up to Kentucky and it worked out okay, but I remember we were in an ice storm and I was trying to dig myself out of all this ice in our front yard. There was not 1 ounce of resentment about, if you hadn't insisted that we moved to Kentucky, we wouldn't be in this ice storm and we wouldn't be in this mess. I was from Florida. I wasn't used to ice storms. But there wasn't any of that because this was ultimately my decision. So I didn't have any resentment. See how much better that works when you think about things in that light. All right. So what is the difference between, and let's talk about this first. What do most couples argue about? You're going to find that all couples, both happy and unhappy couples, all argue about basically the same things. In fact, when you go back and you look at the marriage and family literature, you will find some old marriage and family books back in like the 1800s, 1900s, and they talk about the same stuff. Because in many ways, things haven't changed since Adam and Eve. Couples have always had arguments about money. 2/3 of all divorces report financial strain is a major factor. Another thing that typically is an issue are the in-laws. You want to know the difference between in-laws and outlaws? Outlaws are wanted. And frankly, a lot of the time, there's problems with the in-laws. And sometimes it's sort of like, are you going to defer to your mother or are you going to defer to me? Who's the number one woman in your life? That kind of thing. Raising children. Now we've got the issue of, how many children you're going to have, because you can do family planning with birth control. When are we going to start? How are we going to space them? And then once we have them, how are we going to raise them? A lot of couples do really well until they have to agree on how to raise the kids, and sometimes that can be a challenge. And then, of course, the sexual relationship, as I've already alluded to, in about 2/3 of all marriages, this is an issue. There isn't just immediate compatibility. It has to be something they negotiate and work through. And then there's something known as tremendous trifles. Small, theoretically inconsequential things that drive most people to the brink of mayhem, divorce, or screaming memes, is what one author said. We know what a tremendous trifle is. I mentioned it earlier, the dog-earing of the pages of a book, leaving the toilet seat open or up, and that kind of thing. How you squeeze or where you squeeze the toothpaste. I could probably give you a chance to give some examples if you wanted to. But we all know about those. Now, the good news is if the marriage relationship is solid, you can talk through tremendous trifles. It's usually not a threat to the marriage. But if other things are a problem in the marriage, the love bank is almost empty or overdrawn or something, then oftentimes this is like the straw that breaks the camel's back. So all couples at certain times deal with these 5 traditional things. However, since the 1990s, there's 2 top new issues that couples argue about that didn't even used to be on the list. And that primarily has come from the advent of 2-career couples. And that is, we're both working now, who does the domestic chores? And in some homes, the husband still expects the wife to do most of the domestic chores, even though she comes home after working just as exhausted as he is. And so there's a lot of resentment that comes if the husband isn't willing to pitch in and help. as I mentioned earlier, it's the husband's primary responsibility to be the breadwinner. And if the wife wants to help out with that, that's fine, if she wants to. But if she chooses to do that, obviously she's going to need some help around the house. She's going to need some help in areas that she wouldn't need if she had the time and opportunity to focus on that completely, like it used to be when the wife stayed at home. The other thing is, how do you spend leisure time? The biggest pressure cooker that most families have today, especially if both are working, is there's no margin. Everything is so busy, and you have limited leisure time. And so how are you going to agree how you're going to spend your leisure time? Who are you going to spend your leisure time with? And those become the two new issues that couples have to work through that can be major sources of conflict. All right. Both happy and unhappy couples argue about the same things. And the amount of disagreements and how often the parties disagree is not a significant factor in marital satisfaction. In fact, some couples seemingly argue all the time, but they're very happily married because they have learned how to work through differences without it impacting the relationship. So what's the difference between the happy and the unhappy couple? It's not whether you argue or not. Happy couples argue as if the issue is external to the relationship. They may disagree, but it doesn't change their respect or feelings for the other party. You know, honey, I don't really see it that way. I see it this way. Really? How do you see it that way? That doesn't make much sense to me. Well, this is why. So you talk about it kind of out here. That's what people that can successfully resolve conflict do. Same thing is true with doctrinal differences. I don't see that passage that way. Really? Why? Well, because of this verse. Yeah, but what about these verses? You know, you're just able to talk things through without getting personal. Unhappy couples get personal. They can agree without being disagreeable. They wind up hitting below the belt. They wind up saying things that are unkind. Well, you're just saying that because you're selfish, or you're irresponsible, or you're untrustworthy. You start calling each other names and questioning each other's motives. That causes contempt, which is another major precursor of divorce. Mudd and Hay were two social psychologists, and they found that people would come with difficulties, and maybe they are having differences over money, and they have them work out a budget, and they come to some agreement, and they get that worked out, and then something else comes up to replace it. And then oftentimes they found they were just dealing with symptoms, where the real problem was the relationship itself. What really matters and what's really threatening to a marriage is if one or both parties feel lonely and unloved. If they can't communicate anymore, they feel like they're not understood, or there's really not any point in communicating because we don't get anywhere. They don't see arguments as doorways to intimacy, greater understanding, but just something they avoid at all costs because it ends in a blow-up. When you feel like you've lost perspective, you've begun to forget what you really mean to one another. When you feel rejected and unworthy, those are the problems that cause the marriage to ultimately deteriorate. And frequently, that's the real underlying issue. And then these other things, these sort of symptoms that you say are the problems, are not the real problems. So you need to think through these things and make sure you deal with these first. All right, I also want to talk about something that's really significant and important. There's a real danger in this, and that is that you don't allow yourself to bring up what marriage and family researchers call the fatal thought. In fact, I'll even say fatal thoughts. This really usually has two components to it. If you have threatened divorce, to bail on the marriage, to back out of your commitment, boy, I'll tell you what, that is just like a defining moment in the relationship. That often changes everything. Say you've jumped in feet first and you're committed until death do you part, and then now you start talking about, well, if I don't get my way in this, if this continues to go the way that it's going, then maybe we just ought to call it quits. The moment you do that, you make divorce much more likely to occur. And the reason that is because the other party is so shocked by this threat and the fact that this other party is thinking about bailing, that they then feel the of necessity that they need to keep the other party now at arm's length emotionally. Because if you're going to bail, boy, that hurts. So I've got to protect myself from you. And so the very fact you back up from the other party emotionally means the other party feels the distance, and it makes them even more unhappy than they were before. It just makes the problem worse. It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so you don't ever do that. Well, maybe we're having a rough spot or we're having a difficulty, but we're going to hang in there and work this out with God's help. Because we're committed to each other. That's the mindset. Don't ever, ever think about divorcing or threatening divorce. Now, there are exceptions. There's an exception clause for a reason, and sometimes that's unavoidable. But so many times people just go to the divorce default, especially if they come from a divorced family. Another problem, of course, is when you start telling your spouse, well, I just don't love you anymore. You know, I'm not feeling it anymore. Well, that just means the love bank is empty. That's not really that big a deal. But in typical relationship, you start saying, I don't love you anymore, it's like that's the foundation of our marriage is crumbling. So, always want to stay committed to love. And remember, love is primarily a decision, not just a feeling. So, keep that in mind. All right, what happens during conflict that is so crucial that this is one of the key things that we need to understand when we're dealing with a marriage? 3 stages. The first stage is intimacy. This is why you get married, at least in America and in the Western world. You get married because you want a soulmate. You want this person to be close to, someone you can share your deepest secrets with. So, you know, you're at the altar, everything is going great, you go on your honeymoon, and then suddenly, at some point, you have your first lover's quarrel. You enter into conflict. And if you can't resolve this conflict successfully, you just kind of give up, say, well, we'll have to agree to disagree. Then you go back to intimacy, but not quite as far as you were before, because now you got this brick here. And then you go back to intimacy and things seem okay. Then you have another conflict. And you can't resolve that. That doesn't go very well. Maybe it ends in a shouting match or something because you can't resolve conflict very well. So you just kind of push that away, never really dealing with it. And it serves as another brick. And then you go back to just somewhat as intimate as you were because you've got these things here that are unresolved in the background. You know, when couples come to me, sometimes this is where I'll start. I'll say, let me tell you about conflict in relationships. And I talk about ICW, and I'll say, now you tell me where you're at. Everybody that I've ever talked to can relate to what I just was saying. Everyone. Even couples that are happily married realize you have conflict. Hopefully, if you resolve it successfully, then you go back to intimacy. You resolve it successfully again, then you go back to intimacy. Every couple is doing this all the time, especially in their first year or so of marriage. So, you got 3 stages. You have intimacy, conflict, and withdrawal. And the real serious thing is when suddenly you've just had it. You're kind of at your emotional end. You're kind of frayed your last nerve. And you don't wake up one morning and say, you know, I'm going to emotionally disconnect from my spouse. It's a defense mechanism. You just finally get to the point where you just sort of snap and you say enough and you enter into emotional withdrawal. And what happens with conflict that is so crucial? Entering stage 3 is serious because you basically say, I don't care what you think about me anymore. You're not going to hurt me anymore. And the way I'm going to keep you from hurting me is I'm going to put up this big wall. And all those unresolved conflicts, those bricks, all come together at once into this wall. And you sort of make this decision to keep each other completely at arm's length. This is where the feelings are gone. And this is when the wall keeps out both good and bad. Remember I said you want to start on getting rid of the love busters first before you start worrying about making deposits in the love bank? The reason you do that is because the big wall is created by these love busters that are not acknowledged and forgiven. And so as long as the wall is up, you don't want flowers from your spouse if you've just emotionally disconnected from them. Maybe the spouse now is trying to be real nice and do all these things that you always would have loved for them to do. And now they're doing it because they feel the distance, but you are not interested. In fact, you almost feel like the guy's being a pest because this emotional disconnection keeps out deposits as well as keeps out the hurt. So withdrawal is serious, but not necessarily permanent. Remember how we define passion? That's when the sharing of feelings stops, passion dies. Passion is when you can have the free exchange of feeling in an atmosphere of trust. And when you put up the wall, man, there's no passion there. And the poor woman, she especially feels violated during sexual intimacy because to her, it's so much more of an emotional, spiritual experience. And if she's emotionally disconnected, she may go ahead and allow her husband to have sex because after all, they're married and this is her husband. She's just going to dread that. And it's going to be a very, very difficult, unpleasant experience for the woman and unsatisfactory for the man. And that's frequently what causes the couple to come for counseling. This party, usually the woman, has got the wall up. And they are in emotional withdrawal, and they feel like, is there any hope? Remember we said there's this irony about romantic love. When you have it, you think you can never lose it, and when you lose it, you think it can never be regained. Remember we talked about that? So important to realize that romantic love can be reborn. If you can feel safe to share your feelings again, and if trust can be reestablished so you can process the conflict, then intimacy can be restored. And you can open up the love bank and you can start filling it up again. So this is the key. If you can stay in stage 1, which is intimacy, and avoid stage 3, which is withdrawal, you're going to be happily married. And you can focus on the love bank and make it really rich. So in many ways, this isn't rocket science, but so much of it has to do with your ability to use your interpersonal skill and resolve conflict. But this is the hard part. If a wall has developed, you must be willing to go back through the conflict. So you didn't get there overnight. All these unresolved conflicts are in the background of your relationship. There's all these hurts maybe that have been nursed and these grudges that are being held and all these reasons why you can't trust your spouse anymore that cause the emotional withdrawal. A lot of people like to say, okay, honey, I mistreated you in a lot of ways and I said some things I shouldn't have. Will you forgive me? And you expect you can just sweep everything underneath the rug and start from scratch. It doesn't work that way. What you have to do is you have to go back through the conflict. You have to help them process each of these really serious offenses, get the other party to acknowledge the hurt, ask for forgiveness, receive forgiveness, and then commit to do better in the future so you can reestablish trust. Now that's a very emotional, difficult thing to go through. That's why I always have tissues in my office because a lot of tears are shed on both sides. And sometimes these things go back years. The biggest frustration I have with marriage counseling is most of the time people wait till too late to get help. It's kind of like cancer. The key to solving cancer is early detection and early treatment. And that's also true when you're having marriage difficulties. Get help early. Don't let it simmer. That's why Paul says don't let the sun go down upon your wrath, because ultimately you push that down and it winds up being a hurt that you sort of nurse, and it turns into bitterness and then depression. So these are things that are like poison. You've got to be so careful not to nurse a hurt. One of the things that has been so fascinating to me is to understand this principle. And I'll usually ask the husband to take the leadership and to be humble, and to ask the wife first to deal with the bricks in her wall. And I'll have the wife close her eyes, and I'll say, now, I want you to ask God to help to reveal to you all these unresolved hurts. And all of a sudden, all these strongholds of Satan will pop up in her heart, usually 4 or 5, maybe more, maybe 2 or 3. But they are things that she has played in her head over and over again, like a videotape on a loop. And she remembers all this detail and all these specifics. And it's still very raw, and you get this visceral response because it's never been forgiven. It's never come to the surface, really. So you bring this to the surface, and you ask her to talk about what it is. And the husband, hopefully, if he's the one that caused the hurt, now can kind of feel her pain and acknowledge the hurt and ask for forgiveness and try to help the person to release the feeling of, I have the right to get back at you, to hold this wall up against you because you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. That kind of vengeful kind of spirit. So the more you can go through each one of these one by one and ask God to break down this stronghold of Satan through loving forgiveness, and you forgive each other even as Christ has forgiven you, then after you go through each of these strongholds, it's amazing how then the wall disappears. The strongholds are beaten down. And now you ask Jesus to regain the territory in your heart, the ground that you've given up to Satan, so that you can be pure in heart and have peace of mind once again. And I've seen like a woman come in and her eyes are sullen and she's just so unhappy. And after she forgives her husband and her husband is humble and asks for forgiveness, it's like you can just see the brightness return in their eyes. It's just an amazing spiritual awakening. That's why all of this it all has to do with a spiritual covenant and how Satan can use these unresolved conflicts and these hurts to break that down and to break down trust and to destroy the marriage. And so you've got to have humility on both parties' parts and humbly admit you were wrong for not being more sensitive and for hurting you in this circumstance or yelling at you, whatever it may be. Will you please forgive me? And the other party has to have a forgiving heart. The only time this doesn't work is if one party will not be humble and admit they shouldn't have hurt their spouse in the way they did. Or the other party is humble, but the other party is so hurt they're not going to let go. They won't forgive. And that's the only time this process doesn't have a successful end. But once you can rebuild the trust, then the wall is down, and now you can start making deposits and the feelings return because the love bank is beginning to fill up and you plugged up the holes. Does that make sense? I mean, if you understand how to do this, it's just amazing how you can coach somebody through how to get their romantic love back and how to have a marriage that truly can give glory to God. It is painful, it's a bit scary, but believe me, it is worth it. Think about what happens in nature when you break your arm. You break your arm, and then you set the bone, and then over time you put a cast on your arm and it heals. Nature heals the bone where it broke so that it's stronger than if the arm never broke to begin with. And if you put pressure on that arm in the future, it may break again, but not in the same spot, because that same spot is protected. Isn't that interesting? And so what happens is, if you've been through this kind of crisis together and you are humble and forgiving and committed to your marriage and to God, you get through this and you have a stronger marriage than if this never happened at all. Because now you think, wow, we know how to get through this. We've been through this crisis. Man, we together can get through anything. And you praise God for it. And ultimately, you can be someone who then goes out and helps other couples who have similar issues. which is a great opportunity to help folks and then bring them to the Lord and to the gospel. So, this is kind of a class setting, as you know, rather than a worship setting. Before we close out this, and we have a song, and I make some closing remarks, anybody have any questions about this? Are you thinking about this? Maybe it doesn't apply to you because you've never been in a relationship where one or both parties are in withdrawal. By the way, if just one party is in withdrawal, this can normally be fixed. What's really hard is when both parties are in withdrawal. And frequently what happens is one party goes into withdrawal first, and then the other party keeps on trying to do nice things, and he gets rebuffed and rebuffed and rebuffed, and then he finally gets fed up, and then his wall goes up. And if they come to me and they both tell me that they both have walls up, man, that's much more difficult to fix. It can be done. But you want to, again, get help before that happens, where both parties have walls up and you feel like there is just no hope. Romantic love can be reborn. I have seen it happen many, many, many times. And to God be the glory. Do you see why conflict is so critical in relationships? And isn't it sad they don't talk about this in school? We usually don't talk about this in local churches. People just have to figure it out the hard way. Or they just resolve conflict the way they saw their folks resolve conflict. And if it was good, great. But if it wasn't good, they don't know any better. And we just have to be equipped. You know, Ephesians 4 and verse 12 says the evangelist is supposed to equip the saints for the ministry of service. I've been trying this weekend to equip you to feel like not only can you use these tools to help your own marriage, but really help other people you know when they start having marital difficulties. Because having this biblical bridge and figuring out how to apply these principles is just such a helpful tool. Because I'm so tired of all the broken vows and broken homes and broken hearts. And oftentimes with good people that just haven't realized what's going on in their own hearts and how they need to fix it. Okay, does that make sense? Anybody have any question or comment? Let's not all see the same hands now. Okay. Well, I do want to make some closing remarks, but we have an invitation song tonight. What's the invitation song?
It's number 41 in the blue book.
Okay, turn to page 41 in the blue book, and if anybody needs to come forward and ask for prayers or maybe decide to become a Christian, this is your opportunity to do so as together we stand and we sing.